So the president's lawyer, John Eastman, acknowledges that the plot he and President Trump are suggesting is against the law if these actions, supported by his legal theories, were ever reviewed by the Supreme Court. He acknowledges they would lose 9-0 at the Supreme Court. Unconstitutional, illegal, and he knows that. But the crucial point we learned today for the first time is that these guys did not necessarily see that as a problem. Because the Trump lawyer, John Eastman, said he believed it didn't matter that the court would strike it down 9-0 if this ever came before them. This is never going to come before them. Or at least they would never agree to review it. So John Eastman contended they could just pull off this plot. They could just do it, even though it was against the law, because the Supreme Court would never stop them. These conversations happened in the presence of the president himself. The implication of that is that President Trump himself knew that the plan was to try to pull off an illegal plot in the expectation that the Supreme Court would let them do it.
Did Dr. Eastman admit in front of the president that his proposal would violate the Electoral Count Act?
So during that meeting on the 4th, I think I raised the problem that both of Mr. Eastman's proposals would violate several provisions of the Electoral Count Act. Mr. Eastman acknowledged that that was the case. When I raised concerns that that position would likely lose in court, his view was that the court simply wouldn't get involved. They would invoke the political question doctrine, and therefore we could have some comfort proceeding with that path.
We could have some comfort proceeding with that path. The court wouldn't get involved. They would invoke the political question doctrine. He was confident the Supreme Court would look at that and say, this is a political matter. We shouldn't get involved. So let the political process play out. The success of the plan would depend on that, would depend on the court not getting involved. Again, they believed if the court did get involved, they'd lose 9-0. They wanted to go ahead with it anyway because they were convinced the court wouldn't get involved. And Greg Jacob, the witness today, legal advisor to Vice President Pence, then sewed this up. And we got to see this for the first time as the country today. He sewed this up in terms of what they were proposing would mean for the country and how it would get us very quickly to blood in the streets.
As we've covered, he acknowledged it would lose 9-0 in the Supreme Court. He again tried to say, but I don't think the courts will get involved in this. They'll invoke the political question doctrine, and so if the courts stay out of it, that will mean that we'll have the 10 days for the states to weigh in and resolve it, and then they'll send back the Trump slates of electors, and the people will be able to accept that. And I expressed my vociferous disagreement with that point. I did not think that this was a political question. Among other things, if the courts did not step in to resolve this, there was nobody else to resolve it. You would be in a situation where you have a standoff between the President of the United States and, counterfactually, the Vice President of the United States, saying that we've exercised authorities that constitutionally we think we have, by which we have deemed ourselves the winners of the election. You would have an opposed House and Senate disagreeing with that. So you would have had just an unprecedented constitutional jump ball situation with that standoff. And as I expressed to him, that issue might well then have to be decided in the streets. Because if we can't work it out politically, we've already seen how charged up people are about this election. And so it would be a disastrous situation to be in.
If you're planning on seizing power by means that you acknowledge are illegal, and you are counting on the courts to stay out of it and let you do it, well, you're going to have the question of who holds power in this country decided in the streets, decided basically by combat. Greg Jacob, the president's chief counsel, was not alone, apparently, in making this case. Again, this case that has never been made to the public before about how these ideas were connected, the illegality, the acknowledged illegality of what they were doing, and why there was violence on January 6th and why violence was threatened against the vice president. It was not just Greg Jacob making this case that this illegal plot they were trying to pull off, knowing it was illegal, would lead to bloodshed. Here, also from today's hearing, was Trump White House lawyer Eric Hirschman saying he, too, confronted this Trump lawyer, John Eastman, with that, and that Eastman seemed to think that that price was sort of expected and maybe okay.
What were your prior interactions with Eastman?
He described for me what he thought the ambiguity was in the statute, and he was walking through it at that time. And I said, hold on a second, I want to understand what you're saying. You're saying that you believe the vice president, acting as president of the Senate, can be the sole decision maker as to, under your theory, who becomes the next president of the United States? And you said yes. And I said, are you out of your effing mind? Right? And that was pretty blunt. I said, you're completely crazy. I said, you're going to turn around and tell 78 plus million people in this country that your theory is this is how you're going to invalidate their votes because you think the election was stolen? And I said, they're not going to tolerate that. I said, you're going to cause riots in the streets. And he said words to the effect of there's been violence in the history of our country, Eric, to protect the democracy or protect the republic.
You're going to cause riots in the street. Well, we've had violence before. Once violence is accepted as the cost of admission for the plot that you are trying to pull off. Again, remember, at this point, they're talking about expected violence as the likely result if their plot works. If they persuade Pence to throw out the election results, they are expecting violence and have to win it in the streets. But once that's the plan, once that's what you're operating under the assumption of, once violence is part of the cost of admission, then more threats of violence than threats against Mike Pence that he ought to go along with the plan, threats against him to do it or else. Those are no longer far-fetched either.